technical difficulties, we'll have the backups ready to go and we can transition to that seamlessly. So, okay, so I just click the share button. I don't use a lot of Zoom, right?
Yes, that's all.
Okay. And we want to share.
You can either share your desktop, which is you don't want to because any kind of messages coming through will be shared. If you just use whatever the application is, so if it's with PowerPoint, just select that application.
Application window, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
Yep. And then if you go into, I need to remember where it is. Oh yes, there, you got it.
Very good.
Yes.
And you guys are seeing the full presentation now, no, and nothing else in terms of like this is correct now?
Yes, yes. I
Perfect.
just see that first slide. I don't see any of the other side toolbars. Yep.
Perfect. I got my Q&A up on the other desks.
Perfect.
I think we're ready to rock and roll. Appreciate you letting me
Great.
come a little bit early. I don't like glitches, and then waste 10, 15 minutes just trying to figure that out. So thank you.
You're welcome. That's a fair question.
Omir and Sai should be here any minute. As I say, they're my emergency backups just in case, God forbid, my power goes down, the internet goes down. We'll be able to have them step in and just work us right through it.
Yep. And as soon as they come online as well, I'll make them a co-host just so they have permissions to jump in as they needed. And I'll be listening too. And if you need someone else to share a screen, I'll just find that person and make them a co-host quickly.
Perfect.
Okay.
And now I'm trying to get back to my, I don't really want
So
that.
there should be a toolbar at the top. It says stop share on your Zoom.
I got you. This meeting is live stream. This meeting is being sent to one or more apps. That's okay.
Yep. Yep.
I see. Yes, the stop
Yep.
share at the top.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Now I just need to expand this. Let's make sure the mute and video, I can turn them on. Perfect. I think we're ready to rock and roll.
Great. All right, we'll just hang out. Like I said, you'll hear the prompt come through. We'll start the recording of it at 12:40, and then we'll just kind of sit in the background until you start at 1.
Very good. I'm going to have my camera and microphone turned off just for right now, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thanks.
And I'll do the same. Thank you, Stephanie.
Okay, you're welcome.
Hi, Tsai and Omer.
Hello, just checking my video and audio.
Perfect. And I think Stephanie is going to make you and Omer co-hosts. So if anything happens to Andrew, you guys are able to take over. And she'll be on to help with whatever we need help with.
Yes, that's right. I just made everyone that's on the screen right now a co-host, so any one of you can share screens for right now.
Perfect. I see Andrew is on. Andrew, can you unmute yourself and check your audio?
He might have stepped away, but he did check everything.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Quick question for the group. Do you want me and Sai to remain on video or no, since Andrew's the main presenter?
It doesn't matter. If we want to keep our video off, that's a really good question that we didn't ask. Let me I think, you know what, maybe what we could do is we could probably all keep our video off, and if we need to speak or talk, then we can turn our video on. It would maybe reduce bandwidth and all that. I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts?
Yeah, that's kind of what we're thinking too, because when we do the large presentation, we usually just have the main presenter on exactly that bandwidth, so it's not lagging.
Perfect. That sounds fantastic. Then that's what I'll do also.
Hey, Omir, just one thing for you too. In case they say something goes wrong, I got the mobile hotspot set up on my phone, but there may be a lag before I can make it back. Just in case, so I should be able to make it back unless power goes out. So if I lose connection or something like that, but there might be a lag, so you guys can take over. Manjari, one other thing too is I know we were talking about being able to respond to maybe questions every 1 or 2 slides. Where can I see the questions at? Like the chat for this discussion. I don't see it.
Oh, we don't. Oh, Stephanie, do we not have a chat?
Correct. We don't, these aren't set up with chat functions.
Oh,
We'll play this by ear, Manjari. What I might be able to do is, assuming we're out of time, I might try to do little breaks to allow Q&A in there, if we can, like a mini QA. We'll adapt. Don't worry about it. We'll make it work.
okay. Well, okay, that's what you were trying to explain to me, Stephanie, and I
Yes.
misunderstood.
Yes. Yeah, normally our public things do not have the chat function available.
Shoot. Okay. So, Andrew, let's improvise. Let's do that.
Yeah, we'll make it work. As I say, we'll just be conscientious of time. And the good thing is, Manjari, is they have my contact information. If we're not able to get all the questions, we will make sure they're able to reach out and be able to reach out and get questions from us.
Okay, that sounds great. And then you saw that email that Dan Greenberg had sent then?
Yep, I got them all up. Omir and I prepared some questions. Some of those are way in depth in the weeds. A lot of these aren't already built into the presentation, but for some of them, we'll probably only be able to touch briefly on it. And then obviously there'll be a point of, hey, if we want to have a real in-depth discussion on some of the model inputs and like running the model itself, that may warrant a separate offline discussion, because I think that would probably be a little bit niche, like getting really into the model settings and everything else, right? So I don't know how many people would be interested in going to that level of detail, but we will make it available if we want to.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay.
I'm not sure what just happened because I turned on the recording and then it just stopped recording. So we're recording again.
Sounds good. I'm going to just make sure everything's set to go here. I'm going to go mute and turn on my video, and we'll be ready to go here.
Great. We'll see you around 1.
And Jerry, I think we're right at time. You mentioned you wanted to start intros. You want me to turn it over to you for the beginning part and we just go from there?
Yeah, it looks like I'm looking to see to make sure that we have critical mass. Let's just give everyone just a couple more minutes and then maybe at 1:02 we'll just go ahead.
Okay, sounds great. Just let me know and we'll start jumping through depending on how you want to handle introductions.
Perfect. All right, Andrew, I think we can go ahead and get started. I think we've got critical mass. And I'll go ahead and kick it off. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Fundamentals of Electric Transmission Analysis workshop today. This is going to be a 2-hour workshop. I've sent an agenda out last week as well as another reminder earlier today, so you have an idea of what the discussion is going to be about. Before I hand it over to Andrew Kramer from Olteg, who's going to go through the presentation, I just want to take a few minutes and go through and everyone just introduce themselves and just let us know what department you're from, and that's it. So with that, I'm Minjari Bhatt. I am at the PUC under Aaron O'Neill in the fixed utilities, and I'm an engineer. And so I will kick it off to Bill Dalton.
Good afternoon. My name is Bill Dalton, and I am a staff engineer at the Colorado PUC.
Aaron?
Yeah, I'm Erin O'Neill. I'm Deputy Director of Fixed Utilities of the PUC. And I will say, so maybe all well, I'm not sure if we want to have everybody introduce themselves, maybe one person from each party. So I'll just say that also on us for trial staff are Rebecca Lim, and I think that might be it. So maybe if I can just kick it to public service folks, you can just introduce yourselves real quick, just so that we have some sense of who's here.
Thanks, Aaron. And this is Mike Pascucci, Director of Regulatory Policy at Public Service. I'll introduce our team because I think I may be the only person on right now, but we will have some others joining in a few minutes. Jared Lunar, on my team, my regulatory team will be joining us. Jason Standing, our Director of Transmission Planning, and Claire Van Gundy, one of our transmission planning analysts.
Great.
That's it for public service.
Great, thank you. What about UCA?
Hi, this is Chris Neal from UCA. I'm on this screen, but I think other people are listening on the computer's or the commission's general website. Thank you.
All right, I'll kick it over to the CEO or the Department of Energy.
Yes, hello everyone. James Lester, senior lead on transmission, climate, and energy, former PUC advisor. So seeing a lot of familiar faces here. Thanks, everyone.
And this is Megan Otteson, senior regulatory analyst with CO.
And then I'm just going to kick it over to Dan, and I think that's our last group.
Yeah, Dan Greenberg, I'm an advisor to the Colorado PUC. Michael Eden is also joining the call today.
Great, thank you. And I know people are trickling in, so let's go ahead and get started. We've got a filled agenda. I'm going to kick it off to Andrew. And Andrew, I'll have you introduce the Ultec team.
Sounds great, Manjari. I've got a slide where I've got an intro for myself, and we'll just get to that momentarily and kind of give a quick overview of the company as well. We've got a lot of material to cover today, so I'm not going to linger too long on that, but we'll make certain you know a little bit about us before we get going here. So let's just go ahead and jump into this as we go along. One quick comment as well. I'm going to try to allow questions to come in between kind of like slide breaks. I'll let you know when we'll do that. For the first segment, we might try to group a few of them together because it's more of the foundation. And then between each of the transmission planning segments, depending on where we're at with time, certainly allow people to come off mute. We'll go from there. I know we may not get to all of the questions. However, I've got my contact information provided. And we can certainly set up through email conversations. We can set up separate meetings if we need to. So we certainly have a lot of flexibility. We want to get to all of your questions. So even if we don't get to them all today, we will eventually. A lot of you have been very gracious to send over questions to us. I've tried to build a lot of these into the deck as well as we step through it. I'll even try to call that out as I go along. Some of them were pretty in the depth and into the weeds, you might say. We will still try to cover those fully. But if we can't, we can certainly set up maybe a brief technical discussion as well, such as maybe some of the formal model setup and the model inputs itself, which can be a little bit dry, but there might be interest on that as well. So with that said, I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the material itself, and we will jump to the first slide. This is our agenda today. I'm not going to go into everything on it just because we're going to be talking through it here shortly. We're going to start with some of the concepts for the grid itself, such as frequency and reactive power, which are very important in the role of transmission planning itself. Then I'm going to step back and give you kind of a, what does the cake look like? What is transmission planning? What's the end product? And then finally, we're going to go into maybe what are the ingredients for it? Steady state modeling, transient, transmission operations, and then transmission economics, how all of this goes in to these various pieces as well. So with that said, I don't want to spend too much time on the agenda because we're just going to get right into it shortly. Let's very quickly just touch upon Ultec. We're an employee-owned company of about 1,300 plus employees. Market segments in power, renewables, transportation, and water. Offices located across the United States and Canada. And it's a very fast-growing company, just like the whole energy industry is growing itself. There's a lot of exciting things going on at Ultec as well, and across the industry as well, for the whole bigger picture. I would say just maybe on a personal note, I really like the employee-owned culture. It's a lot of fun here. We're very dedicated to getting the job done, but it's also just a very friendly culture where people help each other out. So as I say, it's definitely been the most fun I've personally had at the company. So maybe that's my personal view on it as well. These are Ultec's core values. Again, I'm not going to read all of them to you, but I just want to share one with you today, and that is enthusiasm. This material is exciting. I love it. It follows me to sleep. I wake up at 2 a.m. in the morning with ideas and everything else popping in my head. It really is, you got to be careful to step away because otherwise you go crazy. You just start to obsess over it. I know you guys in the energy industry all see this as well. There's just so much going on. And today I hope to actually bring a little bit of the enthusiasm to this discussion as well. So with that said, very quickly, we'll jump an introduction for myself and then my two colleagues I have on the phone as well, who will be taking over for me just in case there's an emergency technical problem. So we'll make sure we introduce them as well. My name is Andrew Kramer. Please note the contact information at the very top of the slide. I encourage you to reach out to me if there's follow-up questions or if you think of something. You can also add me on LinkedIn as well. I love to just talk about this stuff. It's not all about business. As I say, I love sharing discussions and talking points and everything else. So please reach out to me. It doesn't have to be just about this process as well. We can talk about a lot of other things too. My background as well, just to maybe give you a little bit of confidence that I know what I'm talking about. I have a PhD in physics from Purdue University. My doctoral thesis was focusing on energy efficiency. And I have quite a little bit of experience in both research and the utility industry. I spent about 20 plus years in research and utility planning. My various fields I've touched on include utility resource planning, production cost modeling, integrated resource planning, nodal market simulations, and integrated transmission planning. We'll briefly touch upon these topics as they relate to transmission planning as well. I have an extensive teaching background, and I regularly publish in peer-reviewed journals from the Association of Energy Engineers, so I'm an active researcher along with doing my daily job as well. And a lot of my current areas of interest include integrating transmission and generation resource planning. A lot of times previously they were kind of disparate, and now we're seeing with a lot of these intermittent renewable resources, you need to do a better aggregate job of pulling them together. It's an active area of research, and recently my most recent publication is going to be on grid enhancing technologies specific dynamic line rating. We also have with us today, and Omir Sai, maybe you guys can come off your camera just in case I have to disconnect at some point. You can wave and say hello. We have Omir and Sai with us. They are experts focusing on steady state transmission planning, huge amount of experience between both of them as well. Utility background like myself as well, and you're in good hands just in case something happens and I need to, as I say, something happens to my connection. If questions show up on details specifically on a lot of the steady state analysis and setting up the studies, we might refer it over to them, where I'm more on the transmission economics and that combined aggregate generation planning work. So that's my quick introduction. And as I say, we've got a lot of material covered. So I'm just going to go ahead and start jumping through the material. And again, for these first 3 modules we're going to go through here, we're going to talk through them and then we'll allow questions to come in. I know a lot of this is going to relate to the generators. And you're going to say, well, why are we talking about this when we're here to talk about transmission? It's because in the world of transmission planning, we cross in between the generation wires and all the time. And even if something's not touched in steady state analysis, when we get to the dynamic side of it, these concepts can become very, very important. It's always there in the background, the generation reliability and reactive discussions, and we're going to go through this together. So as I say, this you might say is kind of fundamentals before we get to the transmission planning arena itself. So as I say, I'm just going to go ahead and jump through this real fast. A lot of you may have this, I understand that, but just in case, I want to give a view of alternating current. This is really the starting discussion we'll get into transmission planning, because everything we do on it is based upon alternating current or some approximation of it. So as you probably know, the United States power grid is based upon alternating rather than direct current. In an alternating system, we don't have just a constant straight line power flow. We actually have a waveform that just bounces up and down between a high and a low continuously. As I say, it goes from maximum to 0 to minimum and then just rises back up and down. You can almost think of it like a slinky where it just, you pass a wave on it and just bounces up and down. That's what we're seeing in the AC, for AC power flow. Just as I say, a quick comment for you're not familiar with this, you might be saying, well, why doesn't my light bulb turn off? Like, why don't I ever see the power turn off if it's actually going up and down? The reason is you're talking about 60 cycles in 1 second. That's how quickly it goes from an up and a down. So it's very fast. You technically don't see it just because of how fast it's actually going, but it actually is alternating. Just a quick comment, because I did mention the light bulb analogy here. You might saying, well, sometimes I see my light bulb flickering. Is that because the frequency is dropping? That's actually what we call a voltage problem. If the grid actually slowed down to the point you could see it, it would actually crash. It actually operates relatively tight around 60 hertz. So as I say, when you see that kind of flickering sometimes going on, it's actually a phenomenon we call in the engineering world called flicker. That's not due to the grid's frequency collapsing. That's more of a voltage issue. So again, we'll talk about frequency when we in these upcoming slides here. Please bear with me for just one slide here. I want to give you a little bit of history, and then we're going to get into the math and the engineering and all that good stuff as well, just for those of you that are not familiar with the history of the grid. I see students a lot of times, they can talk about, Einstein and quantum mechanics equations, but they can't tell me where it comes from. Just for completeness, just indulge me as I step through a little bit of the grid history here as well. So the alternating current was a winner of the so-called War of the Current Wars that was personified by Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. Tesla actually worked for Edison at one point. And they had a severe falling out over the dispute over AC and DC current, along with other things such as back payment. It got so bad, I guess Tesla was actually digging ditches as opposed. He would much rather dig ditches than he would go work for Edison. That's how personal it got. Edison backed DC and Nikola Tesla backed AC, and it should be noted that the mathematics for AC is a lot more complicated. It could have been Tesla making this personal, but I think we have pretty good evidence for it. Supposedly, Edison's support for DC was of his inability to understand the more complicated mathematics associated with alternating currents, which you really need calculus for and differential equations. It was a dramatic multi-year battle between these two larger-than-life personalities, Tesla being backed by Westinghouse, the famous Westinghouse generators. It all came to a head in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, where Tesla and Westinghouse were able to underbid Edison and actually win control and show that AC current was safe and reliable and could be done. Meanwhile, while this World Fair was going on, there was actually a killer in the background that was causing all sorts of havoc. If you ever want to read on this, I'd encourage you to look at a book called maybe Devil in the White City, which supposedly is going to be turned into a movie here soon, which shows a little bit of the history of this as well and these personalities. Again, we're going back into the math here, but I just want to give you an idea that there is really a lot of personal history behind this that shaped the grid of today. And if you get a chance, I'd encourage you to look into the history as well. But with that said, let's get back to the actual transmission planning arena here. Why did alternating current win out? Well, it's got a few distinct advantages for it, just a few of which we're going to cover here today. One of which is the easiest. It's very easy to what we call step it up. You can raise the voltage through what we call a transformer. It's shown on the right. Basically, you can get a low voltage up to a high voltage. And that's important because the higher the voltage, the less current, and basically the less thermal losses you have. That's where you really lose a lot of power in transmission. Dan, sir, I see you having a question. How can I help you today?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I raised my hand because I could not find a chat function. I'm concerned that you are pitching this at too low a level. I'm not sure that anybody really needs a tutorial in the fundamentals of AC and the difference between AC and DC. So I would suggest that perhaps you abbreviate this segment.
That's fine, and we could just go ahead and jump right through. So we will jump through then through the three-phase and move into the role of generation and frequency, which again, maybe something people have not had before. This goes into the NERC standards for BA. And as I say, we'll just go ahead and jump right into those right away. And as I say, if anyone wants me to accelerate or slow down, please raise your hand just like Dan did, and we will adapt to this as well. As I say, completely customizable on the presentation. So let's go into the role of generation and preserving frequency. The use of AC has a price. As I say, it's part of that is the frequency itself. The electric system is built around that 60 hertz, as we mentioned before, and deviations from 60 hertz can cause issues. To be clear, if you have programmable logic controllers, it can trip offline. It can cause all sorts of havoc, especially in industrial processes as well. And likewise, if the frequency itself drops, you can actually collapse the grid itself. This is something we call stability, and we'll be touching on that when we get to one of the four pillars. There's nothing magical about 60 hertz. Europe, as an example, operates on 50 hertz. So as I say, either or you can set whatever you want, but as I say, for historical reasons, the grid itself was set to 60. Skipping right along, the grid itself is sunk into three primary areas. Now, these segments are sunk together partially by DC tie lines. That's direct current tie lines. But largely, other than that, they operate on a separate frequency. Yes, Dan?
Again, Andrew, hopefully everybody that's tuning into this call is very well aware of the three pieces of the grid and the difference between DC and AC and the potential for DC linkages. I don't think this is relevant.
Okay.
And I would ask you to move along.
Okay, we'll keep skipping along then. Let's assume that we probably have how the generators work together for frequency. And we can go into tie line bias control, which is potentially something people don't have at that point. So the control mechanism for the United States to maintain frequency is what we call tie line bias control. And the methodology of measuring what you might say how healthy the grid is called area control error, also known as ACE. ACE is a measure of how healthy the system is at an instantaneous snap in time. And it's measured in terms of what we call scheduled versus actual net interchanges and frequency itself. If you're ever in a utility control center, you might see a big board with the ACE actually up there. And it tells you how healthy the actual system is, how you're deviating from 60 hertz based on the reliability measures that roll into it. The control performance standards measure what I say is the health of the system over a longer term, specifically called CPS 1 and 2. CPS 1 is specifically a statistical measurement of the grid over a time duration. It's driven by a factor called beta and B. We're not going to go into that measurement here, but it is something that is available for you if you ever want to look this up online. And I'll mention the control standards here in a minute in case you ever want to do a little bit of research yourself. With tie line bias control, the key thing is the frequency is the control metric, not the load itself. If you're in Europe or certain segments of it, the load is actually the control measure rather than the frequency. In the United States, you have let's say a generator tripping offline, the load, the frequency, and then the load subsequently respond is what actually happens. And let's go ahead and actually go through very quickly on the BAL standards, just in case you ever want to look these up. Common misconception is actually too much generation is too bad as just little. It's just as bad as too little. This is dictated by the NERC BAL standards. So those are available if you ever want to look them up online. You can just go to Google and put them in, and they will be there right there for you. When a system over-generates, the frequency goes above 60 hertz. When the frequency under-generates, it goes below 60 hertz. And again, too much is just as bad as too little. But a very common occurrence is when a thermal generator trips offline, leading to an unplanned generator outage, and in this case, load exceeding generation. When this occurs, all the systems and generators work to restore frequency. Just to give you an idea of what this picture looks like, because it's going to be relevant when we get onto the transient modeling or the transient component of transmission planning, let's go ahead and go to what the actual disturbance events. And again, if people are experts in this, let me know and we can just keep skipping forward. When a disturbance occurs, a series of corrective actions occur. So an advantage of traditional thermal generation is they have spinning mass or specifically inertia that functions as shock absorbers. This is why your transmission operators, in many respects, like thermal units for a lot of respects. As an example, when we lose a generator, the first thing that happens is the frequency drops, causing a decrease in the load. The motors and everything else see that drop in frequency, and they're going to start having issues and losing and dropping some of their load. The generators that are sunk into the system fight this change. There's an analogy from NERC. If you ever read the explanation on this, I like the analogy of the bike wheel. You can think of the spinning mass as you've applied a brake to the system, and from Newton's laws, those generators want to fight that and keep moving. Solar resources are not directly coupled to the grid. They don't have a direct AC coupling to the grid. They move through an inverter, but there are control mechanisms you can use to approximate a pseudo mass from them. Not going to have time to talk about that here, but I want to make sure we don't talk down renewables and make it sound like they don't have any implication at all. And what you can see here on the right is a typical disturbance event. This is from an example from WEC. You have the grid operating right around 60 hertz, and then we have a few generators trip offline. This was a historical event causing the frequency to drop. And we'll actually go through what happens here to bring the frequency back up as we click along here. So here's an example of what actually happens. This is, again, all from NERC. Within seconds after the disturbance occurs, the physical devices on the generator called governors sense the drop in frequency. They're not a full necessarily what you call intelligent control device, but they pick it up and they're going to work to bring up the generator's speed to start stabilizing the frequency loss. They don't restore it. They actually stabilize it. Within minutes, the generators raise their output based upon the supervisory control and data acquisition, that's SCADA, and this is in terms of the AGC, automatic generation control. So what you're seeing here from A to C, that's the drop where the governors catch it, and then C to B is where C to D is when the automatic generation control is telling the generators to pick their speed up and get that speed back up to the point where we can start restoring that frequency. There's a recovery period that goes into the minutes typically. A lot of time, this is what happens is you don't have enough generators online and we need to call in the reserves. That's why these spinning resources are very valuable for us. We have the bottom again, that bottom figure on the right, which kind of shows the time scale for all of this as well in terms of the control mechanisms as dictated by the control and the frequency restoration. So with that said, we're getting to the end of the NERC one itself, and let's briefly go through reactive power. Dan, I'm not certain if people have this as well. This is maybe power factor and what is reactive and why is it important for things like voltage. I'm happy to skip along. So let me know, Dan, do you think this is something we should briefly cover, or do we want to get more into that overview of transmission planning itself?
Well, I honestly don't know, Andrew. I appreciate the question. And I would, I think, encourage you to go through this because I suspect that it will be useful. If others disagree, maybe they can chime in.
Sounds great. And Dan, to your point, I know you're kind of an expert in this. If we want to go down to maybe something I missed and I'm making it too simple, you're thinking, hey, let's go into this further. I encourage you to come off mute and just let me know, and we'll go through it together. I've got this kind of shape where we go through the math, but also high enough level so people can see it when we talk about voltage support and things like that in transmission planning studies. So with that said, let's go ahead and step through it. And as I say, as needed, we'll actually slow down or pick up depending on what people need. So as needed, why do we need reactive power at the end of the day? And I want to clear up a few misconceptions on this as well. Motors and other electromechanical devices require a set voltage. And again, you probably know this as well. Voltage is a measurement of the potential to push power down a system at the end of the day. Deviations from voltage can cause issues or potential damage to equipment. I can tell you from working transmission operations, especially heavy industrial facilities or other areas that are tuned to very set voltage tolerances, do not like it when their voltage deviate. It can cause their programmable logic controllers, make it trip offline. As an example, I used to work around the steel industry, and tripping a steel facility, a blast furnace offline and damaging it is not a simple proposition in terms of repair. So very important for reliability, why we keep the voltage up. And to maintain voltage, you need both real and reactive power. And I want to touch upon this because it is a confusing point, especially if you come in finance. This term real power is an absolutely horrible term. I wish we'd use something different, but we didn't. It implies reactive is made up. It's not important. It's even more complicated because the mathematical way of tracking this, when you get into phasors, they put an imaginary number in front of reactive. That's the mathematical construct. It's still a measurable quantity in terms of reactive and everything else. So reactive is not imaginary. Real is not the only real power we can measure. We can measure both of these things. Okay, I want to stress that point because this is subject to all sorts of horrible analogies and explanations. These are real things that we measure on the electric grid, both real and reactive. So let me step through to give you guys a picture. And I encourage you to come off mute here if you're confused on anything, because it's going to be critical to what we're going off in the forward. Just let me know. I want to start with a common explanation for reactive. And the common analogy here is reactive is the foam on top of the beer. I don't like this analogy. I'm not faulting anyone that uses it. I know why it's used. But it's confusing in my view because it implies reactive is this made up thing, or it's going to fizz away like foam. It's there, always there on our system. It's always floating around doing its thing. Reactive power is the power used for the electric and magnetic fields, all these motors and devices and everything else. So again, it's critical to make all of our devices work for AC and of these alternating current devices and everything else. It's, again, a very real and measurable thing. If you want an analogy for it, you can imagine a spring with no friction involved where I take and I put a block on it and I let it bounce back and forth. The energy moves back and forth between the energy of motion, kinetic energy, and potential energy of the spring, stored energy. That's all that's happening here. We have the electric and magnetic energy being bounced back and forth between them. That's how these devices work. It's not dissipated. It just goes back and forth for all time to make sure all these various devices function properly. Now, with that said, by producing reactive power, I also increase the real power is what we call it as well. So which does lead to thermal losses as well. So there is a price to producing reactive power. I want to stop here though. I'm going to give about 10 seconds or see a hand raised. Is anyone confused on this topic? I apologize if it's too elementary. We're going to go into power factor next, which is a build out on this. And we've got some time now because we were able to skip some of the more maybe introductory comments. We've got time. So I'm just going to give it about 10 seconds here to see if anybody wants to be brave and raise their hand, which I'd encourage you to do. If there's any confusion, we'll get you through it. All right. Well, I appreciate it. As I say, interrupt me again if questions come up. We've got time. So let's go ahead and jump to my next slide here, which is power factor, which is just an extension of what we were talking about here before. Generator owners don't really like producing reactive power as it takes away from their ability for real power sales, right? Generators have capability curves where if you start producing reactive, you got cut into the real. And how they actually set this up is utilities typically charge if you're using a lot of excess reactive power. There are things you can do on your side of the meter to install cap banks and other things to try to get that whether it's what we call inductive load or capacitive load in line. So you, as the utility, can produce less power for you at the end of the day. That's part of what we're behind here and why utilities typically have a rate structure in place, trying to encourage users to not be over-reliant on reactive power. We would not be able to complete a discussion on reactive without showing you the power triangle and the power factor. The power factor is a measure of the real versus what we call apparent power. The apparent power is the what you call the hypotenuse in terms of geometry, the total power being produced. And if you take the real power over the apparent power, that tells you how much, what your power factor is. The goal is to get that as close as possible to 1, where the real power is equal to the apparent power, because you got to produce less reactive. You're always going to need some of it, but as I say, the goal is to try to get it to a minimal power, so minimal as possible. And that's why we encourage customers to do that. Now, with that said, I think what we have here is getting into the transmission planning arena here itself. We're going to start with, as I say, kind of maybe what the cake looks like, and then go into the parts as well. And since we've been able to cut through some of the elementary parts, I hope we have an interactive discussion when we get into especially the steady state modeling. Dan, I think I saw some of those excellent questions you sent over. I think we might be able to really get into the weeds on some of these points, even though I've touched upon them. And for the steady state especially, we'll pull Omir and Sai off mute, and we may be able to get into those discussions. But I want to stop here. This is a good spot for maybe just a few moments of questions or answers. Anything you guys I was confused on, or anything you want me to go back and touch upon, I'm happy to do that if you need me to. We'll give it about 10 seconds if anybody wants to be brave. All right, looks like we can go forward at that point then. So the reason we're adding this transmission planning slide is here, as I say, when we first developed the slide deck, we realized we didn't give you an overview really before actually going into what was actually happening between the subcomponents as well, maybe the pillars. We're going to give you a quick overview of the foundation itself and what transmission planning is. Now, there is no set studies list for transmission planning. There are standards, and we'll go into the NERC TPL standards here in just a little bit. So there are some, what you might call a bottom floor of things we have to look at. But in terms of how you want to go above and beyond, that changes from ISO, independent system operator, from utility. There is no one criteria I can give you. A lot of times you got to do your homework, and that's what a lot of ULTEG spends a lot of its time doing, is going through standards, ISO documentation. So what's the various planning criteria for these utilities and ISOs that are out there? And the first question naturally may be, what is a definition of transmission planning? Just kind of kidding around when we were first developing this, Omir and Sai and myself, we threw this into Google AI and threw an encyclopedia of definitions at us. I would have taken up 5 slide decks going through that with you. And I just kind of wanted to give you a brief overview of, this is Andrew's definition. It's not a gold standard. This just keeps me sane. I'm certain somebody can, come on here and point out maybe I'm missing something. For me, a simple definition of transmission planning might be a process of reviewing, expanding existing transmission system to accommodate future needs. So the way we study that and try to account for the way the system operates today, as well as the grid of the future. By definition, transmission planning involves a large variety of studies, and they vary from case to case. Sometimes you're very concerned about the dynamics and the economics. Other times you're just interested in a steady state load flow. Like, does the system solve? Do we have a problem? Or anything else for voltage? And all of these have different criteria and things we might look at and things that encompass. And just like there are lots of different transmission planning ways of doing it, there's lots of different transmission planners. And you might get a few of them together and they will argue very aggressively on one way or over the other. So again, there's also a little bit of personal preference that goes into this as well. And let's go ahead and go into these categories now, what this includes. While there is no one definitive model, set of models used in transmission planning study, there are some general study categories as well. Internal at ULTEG, this is kind of what we focus on. For long-term planning studies focus upon aggregate generation transmission system, the studies could potentially be, keyword potential here, I'm certain you could have somebody that disagrees with me, divided into the following categories. So there is steady state transmission analysis, transient transmission analysis, transmission operation analysis, economic transmission, and resource planning analysis. They overlap, they go into each other. And we'll see kind of where the demarks are and where they're good and where they're weak at as we go along. And as I say, I've got kind of the list of questions people pulled up in front of me on the left here. A lot of this is implicit in the discussion, but I think when we get to this end of the steady state, that's going to be a good time for a larger Q&A session. I'm certain Dan and others will have questions. We want you to ask questions. And then we're also going to probably allow a little bit of a break in there, just because I say about 50 minutes in, people's eyes begin to glaze over a little bit. We want to get you refreshed and take a strong as we go into the final section as well. So, oh, I had one more slide here. How embarrassing. I'm so sorry about that. Let me work through this real fast here, and then we'll actually get into the steady state analysis. The operation and expansion of the transmission system is based upon reliable system operations. So again, we have lots of different alternatives from why we might look at this as well. When we go into improving the robustness of the transmission system, we might talk about reconductoring lines, new line constructions, and maybe new generators. I mean, there's nothing to say you can't do one or the other of these as well. If we want to go into the specifics of one or the other on these, we may have questions. Again, Omir and Sai might be able to help take us away on that a little bit. Just as a quick overview of the studies ULTEG performs, it's impractical to name them all here. We've got too many, but these are some real common ones. Injection studies, where we look at the amount of generation you can inject on a transmission system. That's an interconnection for generators. Cost allocation, the cost for how much it costs to upgrade the transmission system. Nodal markets transmission forecast. This is really my analysis. That's when we get into outage duration, transmission congestion, curtailment, the actual operation of the system, and then also generation transmission life cycle costing. This is in the resource planning arena, as we'll get into as well. So sorry, I got ahead of myself there. I had one more slide, so thanks for being patient with me. Let's go ahead and go into those first of these 4 pillars, which is the steady state transmission modeling itself. And again, please come off mute if I lose you or you want to go into greater detail as we go along, because I think we're going to have a lot of questions in this first section. So what is steady state transmission modeling? And you might be wondering again, why are we're talking about transmission planning, why have we spent so much time on the electric generation? The reason being is the wires are very important, but the amount of power and the parameters we're pushing onto that system are just as important. And the common starting point when you start in transmission planning is the steady state arena. In this arena, everything, as you might imply, as the name says, is steady. And it is for a snap in time. I'm going to keep coming back to this discussion. And it allows typically for limited, if any, equipment adjustment. So when you've got an outage, or how the generators respond to a curtailment, or what causes a curtailment, steady state analysis really doesn't go there. It's going to be that snap in time only. It does look at the contingencies. I know that was a point people talked about, but it's under a set criteria under which it does this. So we're going to step through this as we keep clicking on here. So I want to go through what exactly happens when we build these steady state models out here. And as promised, the starting point, kind of as I say, this is thou shalt do this. This is really our starting point for steady state and transmission planning analysis. The steady state transmission modeling used for formal transmission planning is covered under the NERC TPL standards. This is analogous to the NERC BAL standards for frequency. And they do go together, especially when we start talking about the reactive, or I should say the transient component, which we'll get to in the next module here. These guys are used in conjunction with independent system operators and utility planning criteria. So you might say the NERC TPL standards are the bottom floor. That's what you have to do it. This is what NERC puts out. This is what we all agree upon. However, the independent system operators or the balancing authority, I know in WEC a lot of times we talk about individual balancing authorities opposed to system operators. They can put their own criteria on top of it and say, yeah, that's great. You said that, NERC, in your guide, but I think you also need to do this. They also provide a lot of the executable framework. However, we also have the utility. They know their system just like the ISO does, and it is a joint effort for operating the system. But they might be very attuned to the fact I've got a customer class that needs a quality of service well beyond that. So they might come back and put their own requirements on you as well. So again, think of the NERC TPL standards as the bottom floor. Then the ISOs or the balancing authority come in and put their criteria on after that. And the utility comes in and say, hey, that's all great, but I want all of this on top of it, more beyond that. The goal being to make sure we ensure that quality of service. Now, if anybody has any questions about the thresholds between the two of these and what the utility might do, what they might not do, That's a pretty broad topic, but as I say, we do have Omir and Sai here that can go into some of those specifics of the NERC TPL standards. I did not put the NERC TPL standards up. I was tempted to put a screenshot up, but it's like reading an encyclopedia. I'll give you the one that I think is most pertinent or one of the most important ones. I encourage you to pull it up on Google, but it's about as dry as document as dry can be. It's a bunch of definitions and sequential orders of operations and everything else. I'm going to try to give you more of a picture as opposed to that. But if anybody does have any questions on the specific NERC TPL standards, we have the expertise and horsepower that can answer that for you here. From a computational standpoint, steady state modeling is less computationally intensive relative to comparative models. It's probably what you might say the simplest, in that it does not model the time evolution of the system and focuses on a single instant. Again, I hate to keep using and dwelling on it, snap in time, but we're going to keep hitting it here. That is all it is, and that's what it is. As a formal, all the formal details of steady state transmission planning are too extensive to cover here. However, we are going to go through some general statements that go along with this as well. So let's go ahead and step through the steady state models, and I'll try to touch on some of these questions we've hit on before. And I apologize for the number of bullets on this. This came in from questions from Dan and others that say, hey, can you touch on this? Dan and team, please come off mute if you want to come drill down on these points. This is really one of your primary slides. You put this together here. So I'm throwing the encyclopedia here, and we're just going to stop as we hit questions on these bullets. The first question we got is, well, explain to me the role of different models we might see in steady state. Remember, snap and time. I can't run, simultaneously a summer, winter, and like time evolved system. I have a summer peak model. I have a winter peak model. I have a spring model with high wind, where there's like a high wind case where it's producing lots of wind at a given point in time. I can't say, okay, well, that's great. Let's cut the wind by 50% now and just run it immediately. I have to go in there and tell these models to do that. They don't automatically. The generators don't know what to do without me telling them is largely the take. There are some limited exceptions to that in terms of reactive adjustments, and if you allow things to adjust under contingency or not. We're not really going to talk about that here, but we can go down into that if you really want to. Other questions we got is, let's talk a little bit about contingencies and what happens in response to a contingencies. So do things adjust under these models? And yes, there are some limited cases. Load tap changing transformers. That's how we step up the voltage. They, in the system, what we call an intact case, where nothing's under faulting or failing, are allowed to adjust. Area interchange, that's the flow between segments of the systems. That is set in stone, or allowed to adjust under various cases as well, depending on what you do and don't allow to. A lot of times it's actually set, especially for transient. And other things like equipment like shunts, do we allow them to adjust? For system intact, a lot of times that is allowed, but under contingency, we do not allow adjustments in most cases. That is the rules. A lot of this goes back to the NERC TPL standards and the guides associated with it. Dan, I know a lot of this came in from you. How am I doing so far? Do we want to drill down on any of these points? Because this is our time. This is your time, my friend, if we want to go into these points.
Well, I again appreciate the pause there. I guess one of my questions is, and maybe you'll get to this later, I don't know. But one of my questions is, how would a planner know when they have accurately modeled the system? How do they know if their system is actually reflecting the physical attributes of their system accurately? All
right. I have a Andrew quick and dirty here answer, but we did have a in-depth answer that we wrote down together here. I'm going to read that to you. Now, what I have here, though, is, oh my goodness, where did that? I just had it up, and I think I accidentally closed it down. Bear with me. I just got to find it. If I can find it, where did that Word document go? Omir, no, I know we had that Word document here just a minute ago. Omir, can you come off mute? Do you remember which chat we had that in? I'm looking for it right now. Maybe you can just resend it to me in the chat. I want to have that pulled up here. And what we'll do is we'll give you the canned answer, Dan, and then Omir and Sai can take over if we want to go really in the weeds. You could just link that to me, Omir, because I accidentally closed it down. Very embarrassing. I think we have it here. Omir, are you out there, sir? Or are we having technical difficulties?
Yep, I'm sending it to you right now.
Thanks, sir. Say, Dan, we got the experts here if we really want to go down onto it. This is not my exact area. I know enough to get us through, but want to make sure we got it for you just in case. I apologize for the delay there. I somehow clicked the X. Thank you for your patience with me. Ah, there it is. Thank you for saving me, sir. Oh, I just minimized it. How embarrassing. Here it is. We got it now. So, Dan, here's the pre-recorded answer we have for you. How do planners test whether their models they've established accurately represents the physical system? Right. So here's our answer. Through internal processes like facility checks ratings of electrical equipment. In the utility, many different utility departments work together to check, verify, and update facility ratings equipment. For example, where in the utility, the substation, transmission metering, and procurement teams might work together. In addition, utilities provide their transmission topology to the ISOs on the annual basis to ensure accuracy. Let me just add a comment on the pre-canned talking point there too. I've been involved in this through my experience at the ISOs. There's a big to-do where the ISOs and utilities will have multiple back and forths when they're building these large models to verify transmission operations is involved. And there's an in-depth benchmarking period where they go through and test the operating parameters of this to make sure everything is in line before they issue the grand final ISO models that everyone uses. So it's definitely an iterative process.
Okay,
Dan, did that help? Go ahead, sorry.
So there's some checking against like SCADA data, for instance, comparing model output to actual measured values.
From my experience, yes. Omir, do you want to go into the specifics of the transmission operations verification? Because I know operations is involved, but there are also things that do not happen into these models as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, from a transmission planning perspective, yeah, there is, utilities work with ISO through various checks on an annual basis to build steady state models. And this is where you're checking, all of your topology. So your transmission line, the transmission line line characteristics, ratings of your lines, of your transformers, and the topology to make sure everything is, connected correctly in your study area, or if you're utility in your utility service territory. There's various different checks that go back and forth between the utility and the ISO, since the utility gives all this information to the ISO, and then the ISO develops these base case starting models to, like Andrew said, it can be 4 to 10, sometimes 12 iteration, and it's done on an annual basis to make sure that everything is accurate. And definitely through those different iterations of the model, I've been when I work at utility transmission planning studies engineer for a little bit over almost 8 years prior to coming to Oltec, and I spent a lot of time talking to the ISO and looking at transmission maps and making sure that our facility ratings are correct in respect to FAC standards. So there's definitely a lot of different processes built in. And again, it's a team effort at a utility. It's many different departments and studies engineers that are making sure that everything is accurate and represented in the models so that the ISO can build quality models. And that really comes down to why you have multiple passes of steady state models, and same with dynamic/stability models. But yeah, there's definitely a lot. And also a lot of checks with, are all the contingencies correctly defined in respect to their TPL. So making sure that you as the utility studies engineer have defined the contingencies, that all of your equipment, system protection equipment is, how it operates in real life, well, actually how you're taking out the outage in steady state transmission analyses, and then also in stability dynamic analyses as well. So there's a lot of checks. You spend many months going back and forth and checking your data too, because at the end of the day, it's if you have good data coming in, then when the ISOs build these models, then you have good transmission output analysis coming out of that. So a lot of checks back and forth.
Omir, I think you hit on our point in the time scale too to develop these. So I think that got us right into it in terms of the months period that go into this as well. So I say I'm gonna keep working through this slide, but we're gonna stop at the end of it too, and maybe even subway again just to see if more questions come up. And again, I want to say how much I appreciate everyone that comes off mute and talks to me as well. This is not very much fun if I sit there and people know everything or they don't know anything. Please come off mute and again, just shout out. As I say, it's a lot better if we do it that way. And we've got time to do it now. So a key point here, because this touches on more questions we got. In these models, we define the generator output, also called dispatch. You tell the generators what to do. There are no economic decisions being made here. Same thing with the load levels. Snap and time only. I'm sorry to keep hitting that word, but we got to keep saying it. It does not adjust and move the generators up and down. You have to tell the model how to do it. Now, a lot of this came from the legacy of how these models were built in the first place back in the 70s and 80s and 90s when computers weren't very strong and they couldn't really do the full-blown analysis. Even though they're probably the most simple models to run in terms of computational power, there's still a lot of use for them. And a lot of this is built out of that legacy history of the modeling that was developed a long time ago. Into the technical weeds here a little bit. A lot of times we're interested in what we call worst case. This might be a deliverability study where we're trying to ramp all the generators up to maximum and see if I can really get these megawatts out of this generator. Or is it going to be, doesn't really tell you if it's curtailed or not, but it tells you if you may or may not have an issue. We'll get into the curtailment, the outage, and curtailment duration, everything else in just a little bit. Still useful information, though. The other thing I want to point out to you, this is kind of a rookie modeling mistake. Even though it's a little technical, I think people can appreciate this. There's something called the slack and swing bus in these models, and this is kind of a catch-all. If you have a mismatch between generation and load, it's not like the models I run that are done on economic, where it's just going to move the generators up and down. The model doesn't know what to do. And it can't just leave generation and load mismatch where you've got an energy imbalance. It's going to dump all of the energy into, if there's excess, into the slack bus, or the same word for it is swing bus, it's going to pull generators in from the swing generator. They're usually denoted one and the same, slack and swing. Is kind of a rookie mistake, which is amusing. A lot of times what happens if you're interconnecting a bunch of generators and you don't dial down the generators somewhere else, tell what generators to go down to balance that, it's going to dump all that energy into the slack bus. I've reviewed other models before from other people where we've noticed like, oh, everything looks great in this model, but 10 states over where the slack bus is located, we've overloaded by like 5,000% on a line. That's the sort of thing you want to avoid in this arena. And again, it's because the models don't really know what to do. They don't move up and down. You have to tell it to it. Again, snap and time only.
So Andrew, on that, quick question.
Yes,
so is there some kind of alarm that gets generated when the slack bus goes over a certain load?
The reports typically tell you that. But Omir, I think you have some funny stories, and so do I, where people don't check the reports or check the alarms. And there's concern how many of these things actually get through in a lot of instances before somebody hopefully catches it. So Omir, you got any horror stories on that?
Well, we won't talk horror stories, but yeah, there's definitely like area swing bus summaries that, depending on what type of software you use, and also, you can use Python automation as well to kind of build call it the internal QC quality checks of these models to make sure that they solve correctly and everything is balanced prior to running any analysis. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff for you as a studies planning engineer to look at and do checks before you even start doing any kind of contingency / outage analysis. And that's really important because you have to make sure that your dispatch and everything is balanced and it makes sense prior to running contingency analysis. Because if you don't have a good starting point, anything that you do after that is deviating from reality drastically. So definitely a lot of stuff built in, depending on what software you use, whether you're using Terra, PCC, or PSLF, they all have some kind of area swing summary table. Or if you do more advanced Python automation, you can actually automate some of the stuff to look at it from both like visually or in spreadsheets to make sure that everything balances out.
Is there some kind of threshold beyond which you would say, nope, that's too much flow on the swing bus?
I can take this one. You, Omir, you got more experience on this. You first.
No, that's fine, Andrew. I think you got it. Thank you.
What I would say, Dan, is that you really want the generation and load balanced, right? I mean, that's a good model as you try to balance it initially. I mean, what percentage in terms of that there is a deviation, Omir, I'd probably look for you to say that. I know sometimes, if it's not completely balanced, it might be all right. But I would say a good model normally wants to balance the generation and load and hopefully not lean on the swing bus too much. Do you have a threshold, maybe a percent, Omer, if you do see a deviation, you say that's all right, based on my experience?
Yeah, I mean, we can look at it like, a good practice is you want to have your, swing within machine limits. Now, if you go under or over, say, 5% or less, that might be okay, but good practice is to be within machine limits of that.
Perfect. And Omer, you already mentioned some common modeling softwares. You probably will hear the words, if you're ever around steady state modeling, PowerGem Terra, PSSE, PSLF. PSSE and PSLF have been around forever. Those were, some of the original softwares, where PowerGem Terra is a little bit newer. Different features and widgets between all of them. If there's a lot of interest, we could probably go into some of the differences. But again, they're largely similar. They work on the same files in a lot of instances, even where PSSE actually has some additional features like the dynamics, which we'll be getting into in the next module here. So again, we're going to keep clicking forward, but again, please come off mute. We still got time. I don't need to move us along too much. As I say, we've got a little bit of time here. And Manjari, I'm going to stop at the end of the steady state, give everybody a little break. I'll leave that up to you to determine. We're getting towards the end of this. I'll let you leave it up to determine how long we want the break to be.
Great, thanks.
No problem. So building a steady state model, I think Omer already touched upon some of this as well. Steady state transmission models are typically built by ISOs and utilities. We've already talked this into the ground at this point. And consulting companies, they will request these. You can get access to it. Like for MISO as an example, we're going to request MISO's steady state models. They're all out there. And we have something called CEII, which I think is critical energy infrastructure. We have to sign all sorts of NDAs and sign our life away and agree not to show into anybody for justifiable reasons, of course, in the fact that, it is really the basic reliability of the grid. And we certainly don't want that, to fall into the hands of people that shouldn't have it. So building a team and benchmarking models, again, is a major undertaking and done by extensive teams. Omer, I think you've already done this point justice. I don't want to go into that too much. But one thing that is a little bit more unique here is they're based upon known equipment and ratings within the study area. And they a lot of times will bring in neighboring utilities. How big you want to make it is kind of up to you. A lot of times, like when you're talking about the interface from MISO to PJM, you might go quite a few buses into PJM in these models to ensure you capture that overall analysis. You can also do something called equivalency, which is basically you kind of treat it as a bubble outside of yours, where you try to treat it as sort of a mesh. But good practice a lot of times, at least from my experience, again, Omer, chime in, Si, if you think I'm wrong on this, is to at least include quite a few buses in, maybe if you're going from MISO to PJM. So feel free to jump on if you think I'm misspeaking here. And parameters within these models are pretty common. Thermal ratings for lines and transformers, as well as the emergency ratings. The generator nameplate, which may deviate from the output. Remember, you tell the generators what to do in these instances. You got to tell it. So you don't want to go above nameplate, but you might have it operating in the lower state at some point. And then you also have the topology of the system. Where are your shunts located? Where are your transformers? And how are the wires and generators all connected to each other, right? So this is kind of your basic, what does my transmission and generation system look at the end of the day? If you ever look at a PSSE result, it's about as dry can be. It's a bunch of bus numbers, machine operating characteristics, highs and lows, and then, power nodes all connecting to each other and everything else. And with that said, we can't talk about steady state modeling without at least showing you a single line diagram, because if you go into PSSE and pull up the graphics capability or Terra, you're going to see this. These systems are actually technically three-phase electric systems. However, in our system under steady state, the system is balanced. As such, we can reduce it from a three-phase system to a single phase. So as such, we can reduce everything to what we call a single line or one line diagram. Any good self-respecting steady state transmission software is going to have a steady state diagram as well. So you got the dry outputs, but normally it can do a graphical representation. And this is just a very quick single line representation you might see. I got this one from Wikipedia. What you would see in PSSE and PowerGem Terra. They're all a little bit different, but the notation, everything else is the same. And a lot of times we deal with this directly on the single line because you can modify the inputs for this as well. So again, just that final bullet, for a balanced three-phase circuit, we can actually reduce everything to a single line, which is the trick we use in a lot of this steady state analysis as well. The role of contingencies, and I know we had questions on this. Contingencies are defined as failure elements of the system, and they can include generators, line, transformers. A lot of this goes back to the NERC guidelines and what you do and don't take out. And Dan and others, I saw questions on predefined contingencies. We're getting to that at the very bottom. And as I say, I think we should have a good opportunity to take a break here and we can go into depth on contingencies as much as we need to. So the response of the system under contingency is a primary focus of steady state transmission analysis. It's one of the primary tools. And really, when you get down to it, what we're looking at, transmission failures and associated monitored elements, what we often call them are mon-con pairs. That's the lingo you hear. It's basically saying I've got a contingency, something that's failure, and I'm going to look at a line to see if it's got a problem or thermal overload. That's the monitored element. So a lot of times you'll see under contingency and even under system attack, you're looking, or I should say, it'll tell you thermal overloads in system attack. But specifically under contingency, you're concerned about these mon-con pairs. What's failed, and what are you looking at? We look a lot of times at the sequential taking elements out of events. This is a single contingency. This is the failure of a single element. The element is, word is deliberate there. It doesn't mean just a single transformer. It can be more than that. The word we use is element under the famous N-1 criteria, or failure of a single element. N-2 denotes two simultaneous failure elements at the same time. This rolls up to, and again, I didn't put a slide of this document in there. I encourage you to go Google and pull it up if you want to see its defined ads for the contingencies as well, is the NERC TPL 001-5 standard. Everyone has access to it. You just go to Google and pull it in. It's the first document that will come up. It uses a more recent naming convention called P numbering. And that is a little bit different than the N number, because in P number, we're talking about combination of elements. It might be a branch failure, which can be multiple elements going out at the same time, multiple individual elements. However, under the NERC TPL standard 0015, it's defined as one common element under P1. As I say, you can look at P1 versus P7 and all that good stuff. Different utilities have different criteria. Some utilities we've seen in ISOs talk about a P7. And if you want to know what that is, you can just go to this guideline, determine what it is. Now, the other thing that I saw come in is automatic versus predefined. The predefined contingencies a lot of times come in from utilities, the ISOs, and the NERC TPL guidelines. You can allow these other models to say, put in automatic contingencies, and it's going to go crazy and take elements out one at a time and test everything. A lot of good practice. Again, Omir Sai, tell me if you think I'm wrong on this. We see in the utility is we allow the predefined, and then we'll also enable automatic as a sanity check as well at the end of the day. Now, let me skip forward because I think we've got a break coming up here, and that might be a perfect time for actual pausing. Okay. I want to stop here then, because were there any questions on contingencies specifically? Dan, anyone else? Anything you guys want to dive into on detail on this slide?
This is Dan. I have a quick question. So it sounds like, yeah, there's a standard set that are of contingency evaluations required by NERC. Is that correct?
Omir, I know that's guideline what they must do. Thresholds and minimum must thou. Is that in one of the TPL standards? You'd be the best to speak on that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Utilities do follow the TPL 001, which does define high level defines and tells you, what needs to be studied as a contingency or an outage under, P0, which is no contingency. P1 is a single element, and then if you get into the higher P numbers, it's multiple contingencies. So there is definition exactly of, what you need to study to simulate, for example, so one example would be like a P1. And in all of these contingencies, like you have a P1.1, a P1.2, P1.3, P1.4. Now those sub numbers really mean like a P1.1, for example, is you're going to simulate to lose a generator. So you have to simulate to that in these studies that you're going to lose one generator, and then you run the analysis, and then you're looking at thermal overloads, what happens, and you're looking at voltage analysis, what happens. And then you put that, goes back in service, and then it takes out the next generator. And that goes to the whole utilities service territory that you're studying. And then a P1.2 is a transmission circuit. So it's testing contingency analysis for each transmission circuit throughout that utility system. And then P1.3 is a transformer, and P1.4 is a shunt device. And that's well defined in the table in TPL 001-5. So when you're doing your transmission annual assessment, and when the ISOs, for example, like MISO and others are doing, like MISO would be the MTEP, they, look at all of those contingencies. So from P0 system intact all the way up to P7. So it's very defined in that standard. And I know, Dan, you also had another question, is contingency modeling automated or manual? Well, it kind of depends on the software that you're using. So modern software, in a sense, if you know how to set it up correctly, it can be automated, but to get that pure automation, you really have to utilize some kind of programming language. So for example, we utilize a lot of Python integration for PSSC and PowerGen Terra, for example, to help you really speed up that contingency analysis. So it kind of depends. And then in addition, there's something called parallel processing, where if you utilize Python and if you utilize a modern software, you can actually use computation core power to say, for example, you have to study 1,000 contingencies. Instead of having one of your computer cores doing everything in singular fashion, you can actually call all 8 cores of your CPU to divide that by 8, and then you can run the study much faster. So it depends. It depends if it's manual automated. It depends on the studies engineer and what kind of technology / if any programming is used, like Python.
Okay, thanks for that. And it sounds like in a typical study, a utility would have its software, whether it's manual or automated, go through all the various different permutations for each transmission element, or each element, I should say, being out of service. Are there some studies that are more tailored to a specific area of a utility service area, where there are elements that may be very distant electrically and might not be very impacted by a contingency in the area under study, so that might be a more limited set of contingencies that get looked at?
Yes, most definitely. Depending on the size of the system, and the utilities, they know their system quite well. So there's a file that we call a monitor file that's part of this file that's used to run these type of transmission analysis. So you can monitor, say, 3 to 5 substations away from the border of your service territory, and that could be acceptable. Again, it depends on the size of the utility, and also depends on the size and how the interconnection is around the utility and the neighbors. So there's definitely, it is acceptable to, kind of shrink your study area, as long as, as long as you have just engineering justification to do that, that's fine. And then that's pretty common practice. So that's definitely, you can do that. And there's ways to make that study area smaller in these type of analysis.
Thank you.
Excellent questions. As I say, I think we're getting towards the end of the steady state. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep jumping through here. And as I say, we should be able to get onto the dynamics and the operations. I'm going to jump through that relatively quickly, just because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions at the end. So for both system intact, no contingencies, and under contingency, steady and state analysis focus upon variables such as thermal overloads and voltage. We kind of touched upon this previously, right? That, these are the various operating parameters that we look at, and the sort of things we're looking at on the actual output itself. And again, last time I promised single instant in time only, right? So things like hourly behavior, because I know people asked about this. Well, tell me about, the effect of the thermal overload, how long it is. Tell me, is my generator going to get curtailed? This model does not know that. It doesn't even tell you what is going to be brought down or curtailed. You have to tell it how to do that. That is not what this model sort of modeling answers. As I say, it's very much a snap in time only. And as I say, I've got a bullet here, kind of a quick slide through here. We've got a limited time though, so I'm going to kind of jump through this pretty quickly again. Again, benefits, it's kind of a worst case world, snap in time, so it's limited computational time. And it's easily adapted to various sorts of cases like summer, winter, summer, however you want to do it, and a very well broad software history as well. Some of the disadvantages of it: no economic considerations at all. It doesn't even know production costs at all. You have to tell the generators what to do. Cannot study a time evolving system. We'll go into the transient analysis here in just a second, but transient disturbance, economic and outage duration, doesn't know any of that. And the other thing too, I think is missed a lot of time is a lot of this is kind of a fictitious world too. You study worlds of like solar output all at 100% nameplate. In reality, solar never operates at 100% of nameplate, but under deliverability study, you might do that just because you have to tell the generators what to do. Very useful, but again, also somewhat fictitious of how these models work as well. And the other thing is system frequency, which we talked about at the beginning, that 60 hertz doesn't really enter into this. It assumes load and generation are balanced, but that's as far as it goes. Now we get to the reactive, it is going to matter. Now, Manjari, I know we got about 50 minutes here. I think we're making good time. I defer it to you at this point how long of a break we would like to have. I'd like to give at least a few minutes to let people reset their internal clocks and, close their eyes and maybe recenter for a little bit. How long do you want us to give, Manjari?
Yeah, that sounds great. How about a 5-minute break?
I love it. 5-minute break, and I will be here at 3:16. I need to drink myself.
Great, thanks.
Manjari, no rush at all, but when you're set to go, I am. I think we're about 6 minutes past. Manjari, I'm not certain if you said anything. I didn't hear you. I'm just going to get started. Feel free to come off mute if we need more time. I don't want to lose anybody. So I'm just going to start. And again, if you need me to stop and go back, we'll do such. So just go ahead and start working through this now. We're going to go over what I'd say the remaining 3 pillars of the transmission planning arena. These are going to be a lot faster. A little bit more in depth mathematically, especially on the transient and the economics. We're going to only have time for a high-level overview. So I'm going to step through these. And as I say, I think we should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end as well. So I'm just going to go and jump through the first one. A brief overview of transient analysis. Again, this is something that's very important in terms of what we do along with the steady state. Normally, this is run at the same time or slightly after, and it's got its own criteria under which we shall observe and make sure that everything works and solves reasonably well. So the starting point for transient analysis is actually a steady state model that time evolves due to what we call a disturbance. So a disturbance is specifically, it could be a lot of things. It could be a generator tripping offline, a load suddenly kind of happening, some piece of equipment that's failed, a short in the system somewhere. It's really up to the user to specify the disturbance. What happens is mathematically, you start with a steady state model. You introduce a disturbance or perturbation, if you want to be formally mathematical about it. And then you look at how, a lot of times, how a specific piece of equipment time evolves. What does it do with that disturbance introduced? Does it potentially cause the system to become unstable, to trip offline? Does it what we call recover? These are the sorts of questions that go into when we get into transient analysis. And one of the key things that occurs here is what is the response of the electrical equipment? As I say, a very common sort of analysis is what happens to a generator when a disturbance is introduced? Does it destabilize? So we need to know how the equipment actually responds. A lot of times those equipment response curves are preset into the model before we even begin. So again, we take our steady state model and then we time evolve it. We snap it forward in time depending on what's going on with that disturbance. And a key point here is choosing that initial disturbance. I mean, there could be a trillion different combinations of things. And it's really up to the scope of the study, as well as the skill of the modeler, as well as those standard guidelines of things we test, common tests we do, to make sure in the world of dynamics and transient that we're reasonable. So a transient analysis, again, focuses upon the time evolution of the transmission system after a disturbance. And again, kind of typical disturbances, lightning strikes, switching events. There's too many to name here, but there's lots of different ones we can talk about. And again, some of this might sound like contingency analysis. You're saying, well, yeah, but we looked at under a steady state of contingencies failing and everything else. However, we're interested specifically about how a failure propagates through the system from time A to time B to time C. And you learn a lot of different things under these sorts of responses. The most recent blackout we had, which was the 2003 North-South blackout, was tied to generators tripping offline, a swing going down the system causing thermal overloads, lines going into trees that were partially untrimmed, from what I gather, and causing more lines to trip offline. You had some misset relaying or not able to propagate this in terms of the safety systems, and you have a very large, what you might call wave of failures propagating across the system. That was very much a transient analysis that caused this to take out. Now, the problem comes is, how do you guess something like that happened? Who would have known that these specific transmission lines were, the trees underneath them were under trimmed and they need to be trimmed more, and these specific combinations of generators were going to trip offline? Well, you don't necessarily know that, and a lot of this goes back to the NERC standards themselves and hoping that everything in your planning criteria is reasonable. But there are always going to be some subtle differences between the planning and then the operations, which we'll talk about in just a second when we go into the transmission planning analysis. So let me see if I can find my mouse cursor. Let's go forward. Here's an example of some generators, a more local phenomenon of transients. I've introduced a disturbance to my specific generator, off the transmission system, and what is it going to do at this point? Generators, if you hit them with enough of a disturbance, may do something called destabilize. A common way of looking at this is called the rotor angle and the stator angle. It's a little bit probably too technical here, but I'm just take my word for it that that's a very common measurement of the stability of the generator. And if this rotor angle becomes unreasonable relative to a reference, too large, it can cause the generator to trip offline, potentially damage it, and more likely cause it to trip, where the system itself is destabilized. I'm going to actually give an analogy here I like for transients that I think is pretty good. You can imagine a bowl and a marble in the middle of the bowl. That is the generator in a stable state. Its rotor angle is at a constant setting right in the middle of the bowl. I introduce a disturbance by hitting the bowl. The marble is going to slosh around in that bowl and eventually recenter on the middle. That is the recovery of the generator to a transient, some sort of disturbance. The picture we have on the right here from Power World is an example of a recovery event for all the different generators. The disturbance is introduced, and the generator eventually, its rotor angle eventually restabilizes. However, if I hit the generator with enough of a disturbance, it's not going to do this, what you see here on these figures on the right. The marble is going to jump out of the bowl, and it's not going to be able to come back again. Okay, and in that case, we have produced an unstable state. The generator is going to trip offline is what happens. And the actual figure for this would be, it's not going to be a kind of a wavy line converging to a set value. It's going to be something that goes up in terms of the shape and doesn't stop. It's going to go, 10, 15, 20, 25. And as I say, what's going to happen is that's the mathematical solution, and practical operations, the generator is going to trip is what happens. That's the actual response to the transient as well as the disturbance. And I think this is our last slide coming up here. And yeah, this is, again, more of a brief discussion. The advantages of transient analysis, I like to say it's, maybe a few inches wide and 30 miles deep in a lot of instances for what you're looking at. It's machine specific. It studies a time evolved world, and it certainly helps to make sure that system and equipment can respond to a variety of disturbances. Omir, would I be misspeaking to say that, it's run in conjunction with the steady state analysis, the dynamic disturbance, a lot of the NERC planning criteria? Do you think I'm roughly in line by saying that?
Yeah, that's fine, Andrew. Thank you.
No problem. Downsides for it requires a lot of detailed information, such as equipment response curves, very much computationally intensive. And the large models, the ones where you're really looking at the global system outages, again, that's up to the disturbances, what you pick, and it requires very large teams. A lot of this falls into the realm of NERC and the ISOs. We're not going to do like large scale disturbance models necessarily at ULPEG, for like an entire interconnection. That takes a lot of horsepower to do that kind of analysis. And again, the other thing is you got to pick the disturbance or combination of disturbances as well. Limited, but I would say very critical application when we get into transient analysis like this. Briefly, I want to talk about transmission operations because a lot of people don't think of this as influencing the steady state analysis. Like it's kind of its own, dark horse that sits there and makes the system run. I want to actually maybe show that that's not the case. They are very much related, and they run a lot of the same analysis as what you might see under steady state analysis and the dynamics. But there is as a much shorter term look, and it is very important for influencing how the overall longer term system planning behaves as well. So transmission operation and its associated modeling is analogous to transmission planning, much like the relationship between a driver and map navigator. So you can think of your transmission operations team as kind of the people on the road driving along, and they're going to be concerned about all the potholes, everything that could be wrong and failing at a given point in time. The transmission planner is right next to them, and he or she is kind of the map navigator, right? He's telling them what to do. And kind of amusing, just like you can imagine the relationship between the navigator that's got their head in the map and then the person driving on the road, there can be disagreements between the two of them. This is just kind of a point of utility culture. Neither one is wrong, but they look at very different outlooks. And as I say, the long-term outlook planner, which is looking at maybe 10 to 20 years, might miss things on the short duration. And a lot of times there is a source of friction where the transmission operations team with their planning might say, hey, I really think we should need to look at this. The transmission planning modeler was like, I'm not even certain how to do that. So just a little bit of culture that goes up between the two of them, and they do enter into each other from a planning arena. the short influencing the long, definitely. Transmission operations are going to use similar models. They use PSSE and all those other good analysis. They're going to look at the contingencies, if voltage is kept up and everything else. But the other thing they have access to is to the EMS, the energy management system, or the EMS, which is based on the real-time data. It solves on the real time at a given point in time. So modeling a lot of times in real-time operations is based upon dealing with the specific contingencies. I used to hang out in the transmission operations center all the time. And, their standard comment to me is, Andrew, we're typically operating in an N-1 state. There's very rarely a point where the system is system intact. Normally, we are in an N-1 dealing with an N-2 criteria. That's the world of transmission operations, where you have a lot of things going wrong at a given point in time. And in this world, things like system frequency and voltage tolerances are critical to the modeling employed, because unacceptable service quality on the immediate scale can lead to equipment being damages. So the operations control center, a lot of times it's very quiet and no problems, but it gets very intense when there's a system emergency going on. They're figuring out how they're going to resolve a specific contingency with the EMS, not with necessarily PSSE or any of those other models, to avoid interrupting the customer. And I think, yes, just quickly into our operation summary, and we're making good time here. Analysis is performed in the real time, and again, very much related to customer service quality, uses the EMS, and based upon heavy coordination between the utility and ISO. The ISO operations team are constantly calling the utility transmission team up, and they're trying to coordinate outages and issues that crop up on the system. It definitely incorporates aspects of both steady state and transient analysis on it. Typically, it's shorter term look. And again, for security, very few people have access to this kind of data. Usually not focused on longer term system upgrades, but I do want to let you in on a little secret here. This is kind of what Andrew's done for his years. When I'm looking at a long-term generation expansion plan, or even some sort of transmission expansion plan on the economic side, or anything like that, the first place I went to was transmission operations. I would ask them flat out, I said, hey, where do you think if I need to build a black start unit, where would it be useful to you guys? And they're almost like human computers over there. They can tell you flat out, I can tell you what the transmission planning models are going to show, Andrew, but here's what I can tell you based on our typical outage pattern of where I've got a problem on the system and where I would put a black start unit as an example, just kind of a case in point. Good planners will consult and work with transmission operations, that kind of human computing element. That's an invaluable resource that I think I come out of the world of transmission operations, so I'm a little bit aware of this. It's an invaluable tool that a lot of time is not taken into account. Now, we're going into the final segue here, and we're making good time, and I want to stop here. Dan, team, anyone else, anything else we want to dive into on this various point, or do you think we're okay at this point? Going once, going twice? All right, let's round out into the final 4 slides, which is going to get into that discussion of outages, overload duration and outages and all of that good stuff. And I should say curtailment, because we did have quite a few questions on generation curtailment come in. This is my actual area of expertise. It's more on the transmission economics, and then the resource planning of what are you going to build, what are you going to retire. Just to be clear, I run an internal training course on this at WULTEG. It's about a month long, and we've got about 30 lectures. We go on into the gruesome mathematics, the overview. I got 4 slides here. We're not going to have time to cover it all, just with very broad brush strokes. I hope to answer enough of the questions that came in and maybe get you interested if we want to have a follow-up workshop on this as well. I think we have a couple more coming up. So if people want to talk about curtailment and, thermal outage duration, we can definitely get into the mathematics of the model. And as I say, I can go as deep as you want in terms of how this works, in terms of thermal overload and how we keep everything out of the system. And if there is a thermal overload, the penalty and everything else. But we're not going to have time for that today. So what is transmission economics? For any system with excess generation capacity available, there is a least cost configuration in terms of the generation online and running in given in a point line. Transmission economics focuses upon the engineering as well as cost behind running various combinations of generation, what we call the production cost behind these generators. These are the inputs that go into my model when we're doing production cost modeling: the generator heat rates, the fuel cost, variable O&M, all that, the ramp rates, how quickly they can move up and follow load. You can go down to the sub-hourly level on this stuff. It's just, it's pretty intense in terms of the computational modeling. The other thing that's the same thing on the steady state is, in fact, a lot of times my models share the same ISO databases, the same transmission models between the steady state, is the transmission system with the ratings involved. We have the same ratings that come out of the ISO models. These transmission ratings serve as a constraint on the economic optimization, along with other characteristics such as ramp rates. So what happens is I'm taking through the details of how this works, but there's this least cost world that comes out of it. And then we're going to put all these additional mathematical constraints on top of it when we actually try to solve the actual system itself. So the generator production costs, I say that's the cost to run the generator at a given point in time, along with the physical constraints, like the physical load on the system at a given point at the nodal level, what's going on at every specific bus, form the basis of a mathematical optimization problem. Specifically, the technique we use is called Lagrange optimization. It's in, like, as I say, MISO BPM2, if you ever want to go into the actual mathematical optimization theory behind this. This is a famous problem. It's called the dispatch commitment solution. And as I say, that's gone back since the 1950s and 60s when they were developing this. And this tells you first, what do you turn on? That's the commitment problem. And then where every generator sits at a given point in time, an hour or sub-hourly. We come back to this model if we don't want to run something moving from what we call a zonal model with no transmission to nodal, and we overlay the transmission restrictions. I'm saying, okay, well, this generator wants to run here, but it's going to cause a thermal overload here, which means we got to dial down another generator over here. And these models iterate with the transmission solutions until it reaches a convergence criteria, under which the model we've said basically it's good enough, or within parameters, it's solved. And this is what we call a nodal market simulation. It can be run with and without contingencies. This is called a security constrained economic dispatch. If we allow contingencies come in, it's called security constrained economic, or SCED analysis. And that's basically where we put the contingencies in predefined one at a time. And Dan, this touches on a very important point of a question you asked earlier. Where can you put all the contingencies in here? I would say, yes, I could do that for, let's say, ERCOT. If I do that, I kid you not, this model will take 6 months to run. I have to determine the relevant contingencies if I'm going to do this kind of modeling. Otherwise, the problem is too complicated to solve. You have the button you can click on a model like Encompass or Plexos, but if you run it just without putting any restrictions on it and limiting the contingencies, it will literally take 3 to 6 months to run on some of these larger data sets. This is the kind of analysis, because I know we had questions on it, that predicts generation curtailment. If overloads are going to happen, you can put a penalty price saying, yeah, I'll allow you to exceed the rating on this line, but we're going to penalize you $5,000 on it. That's a very common ISO operation procedure in terms of how you try to get these generators to back down. It forecasts the locational marginal price, also known as the LMP. And the other question we received is, a component of the LMP is the transmission congestion. That is a measurement of how bad your generator is harming the system, and how much we have to redispatch to accommodate. It's a function of what we call the PTDF, the distribution factor, and the shadow price. If anybody's really interested in this, I'm happy to go into the details on it. It's not too complicated. We can get illustrations in terms of tolling charge, but we are getting near the end, and we're just not going to have time for that today, especially because I want to give a little bit of time for Q&A. One more broader picture. Again, this is easily a 3-month topic we could talk about here in terms of the underpinnings of it, and that is the resource planning itself. The dispatch and commitment models also serve as the basis for resource planning studies. And this is, what are you going to build? What are you going to retire? This is in the integrated resource planning space. These models have new information in them as well, where we put in capital construction costs. That's the, or you might have heard the term overnight delivery charge. That's something we're put in there. We also have to put in there finance structures, depreciation schedule. I know you guys on the finance side will probably be able to, I don't want to display too much of my ignorance here. I normally work with accountants on this point when we develop these kind of models in-house. And we use all these depreciation schedules, weighted average cost of capital, that's the price of money, to develop a total NPV of various construction and retirement alternatives. And as I say, a model like I use Plexos or one of the similar softwares, Encompass, it'll develop 10,000 plans for you. Okay, well, here's the cost if you develop a nuclear generators as an example, or let's say you want to do wind batteries and a complete renewable portfolio. You can tell the model to do that, not allow it to build anything else. But normally what happens is You put practical restrictions on it in terms of when generators can likely come into service based on build time and procurement chains. And this modeling will tell you what is the cheapest alternative and what to build and what not to build. And this forms the basis of the analysis for integrated resource planning and the associated integrated transmission planning. Open research area. It's an area all utilities are working through right now. Nobody's quite figured out how to put all this together. The generators and the transmission planning. And a lot of this just comes into how long it takes to run these models. You can't run it unrestricted. I kid you not, if you tried to run an entire uncontrolled model for, let's say, MISO and told it where to build and retire the generators, it would take longer than the length of the universe to run if you put in transmission restrictions. The modeler has to be savvy and use their instinct as well as how deep to cut the system. Dan, that was a key point you raised earlier. How much can you cut down the system? It's critical in this line of analysis because of how long it takes these models to run and converge. And very quickly, we're almost at the end. I know I've been squawking at you a while. Thank you for bearing through with me on this. Let's just go very quickly over the advantages of this kind of model. Combined economic reliability inputs to forecast system costs, generation curtailments level. It'll tell you overload durations, curtailment duration, all that good stuff, transmission congestion, how much and how little and how long, and other relevant information like operations parameters. Available for hourly or sub-hourly. The downside of sub-hourly is you have to have sub-hourly load data, or it doesn't tell you anything. Used to determine best plans for generation expansion retirements. May or may not include transmission limitations. Again, just how long it takes the model to run. And the other cool thing about it, it'll tell you operations parameters like, well, I know my battery doesn't have an infinite amount of charge to it. When's the best time to deploy it? Do I have enough of it? Recently in ERCOT, we saw some examples in the news media recently where the pricing signal was high in the evening, but it was going sky crazy during the day where there was load shed event going on, right? A lot of this predictive analysis can tell you when you should charge and when you can really take advantage of those price spikes, or when you can, cherry pick the market if you were a independent power producer. Still limited because you may have a limit on the forward look ahead, but you can do this kind of analysis with this model. Disadvantages, longest run times by far. It's really up to the modeler to figure out how to truncate these models. Requires a huge amount of model inputs. As an example, in the steady state model, remember, you tell the generators what to do. In this case, the generators decide what to do based on the operations restrictions, but you got to have the restrictions put in there. Otherwise, it's going to do crazy things like have instantaneous, the model can move up from 0 to 500 megawatts in a minute. It's up to you to put that modeling information in there. Does not currently include voltage and like reactive power. It's not to say you couldn't do that, but again, you already have a model that can take hours to days to weeks to run. Overlaying and have it solved for reactive is a real problem, but we're getting there. There's ways they're putting and introducing sanity checks on voltage and reactive power flows. And this, again, is probably the most broad. It's electrical engineering, it goes into mechanical engineering when you get into generator heat rates, economic modeling if you want to go into debt to equity splits, WACC, depreciation schedules, all those scary things that I know a little bit about, but can be pretty dangerous for somebody that's more of an engineer. It definitely requires a very large team to support this kind of analysis. Now, I think we have a conclusion slide here just to round us out, and then we go into questions. And again, transmission analysis is based on a broad set of topics, and it's not one model approach. If you ask somebody what transmission planning is and modeling, you're going to get a variety of answers. It requires a variety of models to understand risks and opportunities. There's a lot of right ways of doing it and also a lot of wrong ways. And I just want to end with a quote from George Box that I think is very pertinent here. Never believe these models are all seeing oracles into the future. Some models are useful and some models are wrong, but some of them are useful at the end of the day. And that's what's happened here. Our models are never going to capture reality. The operations models being the closest. That does not mean they're not useful. And again, our quote from Monty Python here, please remember they are only a model. Never fall into the trap of thinking that Andrew has produced a model for you and this is what is going to happen. This is the world as it's going to evolve. That is not the case. It has limitations with it. We're going into questions now. And before we go, I want to say thank you to all of you. Dan, you especially. Half the time these things are really dry if no one interacts with you. Thank you for moving us where we needed to be. I know a lot of people don't want to come off mute and interact with us. It's really boring if I just sit here and I don't know if anybody's following along. So Dan, I want to thank you personally. I hope we can collaborate in the future and you reach out to me and the team in general and we have all sorts of fun discussions together because you made this discussion for me personally a lot of really fun. I want to turn it over to the group. I'm running low on my voice. We got Omir and Sai. We can go into as much detail as you want. And majority, I think we got 20 minutes for Q&A. I hope I timed this well. Oh.
Well, given the dead air, this is Dan. Thanks so much. It's been very useful to me already. I do have a few questions that I hope we get to today, but I don't want to monopolize the resource here. So I'm going to step back and hope that others step up with their questions. And if you don't, I will.
I'm looking for hands. Dan, if we don't got anybody, my friend, I'm going to turn it over to you. And as I say, we just appreciate you interacting with us here. We've got the experts here. Let's use this time and get you those answers you need. And as I say, if we run out of time, we don't have to stop here. We'll follow up with questions later. The floor is yours, my friend. How can we help you today?
Okay, great. So assuming that a utility has set up a study, and they've conducted a study to ask certain questions and get answers to those questions, how much time and effort are involved in varying the parameters to look at alternative assumptions? So let's say you are assuming that a given generator, or let's say you have 10 generators and you've made assumptions about the level that each is going to be generating at, and you want to then modify those assumptions, the generating level for those 10 generators. How long would that take to make the revision?
Well, Mary, I turn over to you. I think this one's actually a pretty not too bad. I mean, that's a relatively quick change, but what's your experience on that, Omir? Because I think for 10, it's not very bad at all. You have the floor, though, sir.
Yeah, I mean, if it's only 10 generators, and Dan, you said like you want to change the dispatch on all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a little dependent on what software you use and if you have like Python automation, but let's assume you're just using a standard software like PSSE or PowerGen Terra. It's good practice from a studies planning engineers. Once you are done with the analysis, at that time, you already have one-line diagrams built of those generators, so you can visualize them. It's a fairly quick change to go on a one-line diagram because you already done the study, you already modeled the generator models, so you have all the parameters, and then you're just changing, dispatch. That's a pretty quick change, whether you do it off the one-line diagram and you rerun the analysis. And the caveat here is that's a small change in a steady state analysis. Now, stability dynamics is a different topic.
Yeah, I'm just interested in steady state, and all of my questions regard steady state.
Yeah, I mean, like, to change it, you're talking about, about an hour or two, and then depending, like, let's assume you have no Python automation, you can probably run that in the next, say, depending on the system, depending how many contingencies and stuff, but let's assume a medium-sized system. Let's assume you're doing N-1 only, so you're maybe testing about 500 to 700 contingencies. And let's assume that because we have powerful computers these days, you're doing parallel processing. You're not just using one core of your computer. You should be able to rerun that within 8 hours and do some quality checks on that and basically look at your new results output for thermal only. Voltage, it might take a little bit longer to cross-check some stuff, but it's a fairly quick change, assuming that you're using good software. Again, you kind of done all the heavy lifting of making a one-line diagram. You already model those generators, so you're just varying that one parameter. Now, if you are doing anything, above that, it'll take longer. Again, with Python and parallel processing, you can even speed that up more. So it's not a big change. Again, sticking to thermal steady state contingency analysis only.
Okay, thank you. And let's see. So Andrew mentioned several times that these steady state models are always looking at a specific instant in time. I'm wondering if it is practical and or I guess how difficult it would be. So frequently, we're presented with transmission modeling results demonstrating overloads on a set of elements at a certain point in the future. And they would tend to be looking at, stressed conditions. How, I guess the general question I'm wondering about is how planners identify whether given overload is, I guess, rank the severity of overloads. How do you know when an overload is going to be persistent at, in under other conditions when you're only looking at a specific snapshot? And so specifically, I'm wondering how difficult would it be to look at how the set of overloads change at, let's say the utility has modeled it at peak conditions. How difficult would it be to model the same system at points further down the load curve? So let's pick a specific, like, let's say you wanted to look at a set of 5 other load levels. Perhaps, your 5th load hour, your 25th, your 50th, your 100th, and your 200th highest load hour. How difficult would that be, and how long would that take?
Yeah, so that definitely takes longer because, now you're adjusting load, and you can kind of think of each of those 5 different load conditions. So I'm assuming when you say load that they're like scaling down the native load or certain loads inside of the system.
Yeah, and I would, let's say you're actually working off of the existing or the projected load duration curve.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, that takes a little bit more time adjusting that, because you have to then basically make 5 model sensitivities, because at this time you have 5 different load profiles or forecasted load profiles. Again, building internal Python automation. So Python programming is definitely in our industry, in transmission planning, the last 10 years has, if you're implementing those good Python practices, and that's why all the, PSSC, PowerGen, Terra, and others really have a Python API. Depends how the utility and studies engineer is set up, right? If they're using Python, that's, much, much quicker. I mean, you can have time savings of 2, 3, 5, 10 factor, depending on, the knowledge of Python in these type of analysis of the studies engineer. But that does take longer. That can definitely be a few days to like a week or so, because you're testing a lot more things. You're looking at, you first have to make sure you can solve the model, everything checks out, and then you start applying, contingencies. And if you're doing that without Python, it definitely can take longer. Studies that, we utilize a lot of Python on our end for, reasons like that. And I've utilized Python for many, many years, because when I work at utility, there's always, small changes and model sensitivities that we had to run. So, a little bit harder to answer the question without, if you assume like you have no Python in here, yeah, you probably take, a week or two to look at thermal probably only, to cross-check a lot of stuff. That's kind of what I would say. Again, we're talking about a pretty small system here, like depends on the system too, right? Because the way to think about it, on the transmission planning studies, like the top 2 things that I think about when I'm looking at transmission system is how many substations, and roughly, what's the BES infrastructure. If you have a small system, 7 to 10 substations, yeah, that's, relatively quick. We're talking about few weeks, you can do a detailed, steady state analysis with Python automation. If you're doing it, what I call brute force, just through the programs, no automation, yeah, that can take 3 to 4 weeks. But when you start talking about big systems, like, your big utilities, yeah, definitely, that takes longer, because you're running, thousands and thousands and thousands of contingencies. And again, not using Python and not using computational powers and just using a single course, that takes a long time. And, parallel processing is something.
Homer, this last part of your question, I'm wondering, are you discussing just modifying the load level? I mean, you would also need to, adjust dispatch as well, so to balance. But are you discussing that, or are you discussing a larger, more general study of the system?
Just adjusting load generation and making sure you converge the model, right? Because sometimes when you adjust too much of a model, if you're not, careful and doing all your checks, you might diverge on the solution of the model. So it can take you a few days trying to figure out, why all of a sudden your transmission model is not even converging. Because if it doesn't go within what we call an iteration convergence, it's not a good model to even do any analysis.
Okay.
One thing that too, not to cut you off, I just wanted to touch on one point to build on what you're talking about, sir. A lot of these generators, because they can't adjust, they're fixed in time. You can put multiple snaps in there, but there's also the point where you want to look at the hourly behavior, where you say, okay, well, what's my congestion price when the generators start trying to move up and down automatically? If it gets so bad, what happens when it actually curtails? So the models themselves do cross between the more operational and hourly data versus the snap and time. And Omer, maybe would I say I'm wrong, Omer, that there's kind of a point of diminishing returns on the number of snaps you run, where you might move into more of an hourly based model look as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you always want to have good practice and follow kind of what, industry standard is. And of course, a TPL tells you what to look at. You're talking about near-term planning, you're looking at 2 to 3 year model outlook, long-term planning is 5 to 10 year planning. And you want to catch, kind of all the seasons. You want to look at summer, you want to look at fall or winter if it's applicable, or high wind conditions. Definitely want to, look at multiple different seasons. But yes, there comes a time where you make a decision to go more into what Andrew is talking about, to really look on the hourly time frame.
Okay. A related question I have is, how do utilities, let's say a utility does a study and identifies that with the addition of a set of generators and forecast load growth, there are going to be, the study indicates that there are going to be a number of overloads on various elements. How, and let's say the utility can't address all of those overloads, quickly. What process do you see utilities using to prioritize overloads? The ones that they will address in, how do they prioritize the different overloads that they see in terms of how they're going to mitigate them?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, if you're having a lot of generation coming on your utility transmission system, you have to be reliable, right? You have to respect NERC TPL 001. So the first kind of high level test you would do is what we used to call N-1 contingency, or looking at, single contingencies. And then you'll get all these transmission upgrades that need to happen. Now, you can't really, in a sense, pick and choose and say like, oh, I want to prioritize, a 230 kV line over a 345 kV line. Once you do that study, in respect to TPL 001 NERC standard, if that generation is coming online and those generators are going to go through the CUBE process, you have to address the problems. Now, this is also a question of how fast can you procure, right, as well, to build transmission lines, or how fast can you procure to get transformers, because we all know now the procurement time has drastically increased. So from a reliability perspective, there's really nothing in the industry, from my experience, where utilities can kind of pick and choose, because the study shows you what the issues are under TPL.
All right, well, let me I guess be a little bit more specific. I mean, every transmission study requires the utility to make choices about, lots of choices, right? As you've discussed, but it does require the utility to make, in particular, choices about dispatch level of generators. That is something that the utility has control over. And if a set of those choices might lead to overloads, whereas a different set of choices might not.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, I understand your
And
question.
so I guess what I'm trying to understand is, how do you determine whether the overloads that you're seeing are could be are the result of some of those choices, different choices might yield different results.
Yeah, so definitely if you're talking about utilities picking dispatch based on fuel type, right? Just from a high level reliability perspective, not really a generator deliverability perspective, meaning looking at everything in nameplate capacity to see if you can actually deliver this power out to the transmission line / load. Yeah, so I mean, like if you look at certain ISOs, throughout the country here, for example, like, in MISO MTEP, there is kind of set dispatch per fuel type percentage that they're looking at. That's, set in, like, for example, in MISO. So yes, utilities can make that choice. However, from a deliverability perspective, you kind of have to look at it nameplate capacity. One thing to kind of think about is it depends under what type of contingency those say transmission constraints or upgrades are showing up, right? If it's a multiple contingency, you are allowed to do some, other local redispatch in your utility service territory to, help alleviate those issues. So there's talks like that in utilities. Of course, there's talk in utilities also. Okay, this is what the study shows, what needs to be upgraded, but can we build our system in a different way, whether it's bringing in a new transmission line or, doing another circuit in parallel with the circuit that's overloading. So there's kind of optimization transmission upgrades you can look at as well. Again, this really comes down to the utility, the ISO and / the generate interconnection customers column that's have those, deeper discussions. So there's definitely a lot of stuff to look at. One thing that I would say is if you have, 10 generators or you have more than one generator, what we do in the industry is called like cluster defects type of analysis, where once you do that specific defects analysis, you can actually look at how much harming megawatt impact each generator is putting on this transmission line that needs to be overloaded. And thus, you look at a defects percentage, you can kind of look at the drivers, the generators that are really causing a big issue. So maybe there could be talks of, reducing that generation, whether if it's an operation perspective. Again, this goes into a little bit way beyond, transmission planning. This goes into more like, the structure of reducing this output from these generators. That goes more into contracts and a lot of other stuff, but there's a lot of stuff to look at. Again, defects analysis, a cluster defects analysis is the way to go when you have more than one generator, because that really tells you which new generator is driving the issue. So, we do a lot of these studies and you can actually see how much you can reduce generation from each of those generators proportionally, perhaps, across all the generators to get that to 100% loading so you don't overload it. But that does mean that everybody's going to have to reduce generation, and you look at the highest defects or the generator that harms that transmission line the most because they are outputting a certain amount of megawatts.
Got it. And is the term defect like DEFECT?
No, the term is DFAX. Yeah.
And okay, so what does that acronym stand for?
Yeah, it's distributed flow analysis, so defects. There's a lot of different words, and actually Andrew uh, he said PTDF, which is similar. There's a lot of and you might actually there's another acronym, right, Andrew? Kind of depends which part of the country you're looking at and what you're looking at.
You're right. PTDF, shift factor is another one, shift and factor. And what happens, Dan, is that this analysis Omir is talking about is the first step if you want to go back and measure the transmission congestion, which is how much a generator should back down on an economic basis. You just take the DFACS analysis he pointed to, it's one and the same word. You overlay something called the shadow price, which is the penalty measure for redispatch. And that's what the shadow price really is. It's a tolling charge and a redispatch penalty for how much the generators can move up and down. You take the shadow price times the DFACS or the shift factors, depending on it. You sum it for all the lines up given your generator, and that gives you the transmission congestion charge at your generator. Or in Omir's language, a severe negative price on congestion indicates your price is being eroded, indicating you are a severe harming generator. If it gets too bad, we just curtail you into the ground. Whereas if it's positive, you are helping generator alleviate the overload, and you get a positive impact on transmission congestion. Say the
so in case like you're describing, you might if there was harm being done by a generator, it might be beneficial to back that off as opposed to mitigating the issue through additional transmission investment that might solve the problems, for instance.
Exactly. And where Omir has to tell the models to do that, that's the steady state analysis. My generator is based on the production cost auto dial down or auto dial up. And as I say, if it's real bad, you're causing an overload who can't get rid of it, it's just going to curtail you, is what actually happens at the end of the day. And that's the sort of analysis you get from that additional step where you include the shadow price.
Yeah, and then if you look at, the MISO business practice manual, like MISO, PGM, and KISO, distribution factor defects is basically just a percent change of the generators as they're increasing their input. You've calculated this percentage per 1 megawatt of input or extra generation, and that really tells you which generator is driving that transmission upgrade. So it's very important, something that we do a lot here at Olteg.
Very interesting. Thank you. Well, I know that we are a little bit over time. I do have a couple of quick questions, but I'm going to bounce it back to Manjari or others on the trial staff team to see if we can continue or need to leave it there.
So this is Erin O'Neill. So I think it's a little bit up to Andrew and the Olteg folks. I think if we have a few more questions, that's okay. Just reminding folks of, maybe if we can target being done by 3:15. Andrew, does that work for you?
Works fine with me. I got nothing going on there except cooking dinner. So Dan, I'm at your service. And if we can't get it all answered here, we're available for you. So we'll plan for 4:15. As I say, we got Omir and Sai both here. So depending on where we're going to cross in, it'd be just easier to answer them now. But Dan, we can certainly follow up. So the floor is yours again, my friend, and I'm happy to just keep going on.
Great. And just to clarify, sorry for the listening audience, that the Olteg folks are on Central Time. So when Andrew says he's going to 4:15, he really means 3:15 Mountain. So that's all. And just gentle reminder that we're trying to keep these conversations generic about sort of generic planning processes. And anyway, but back to you, Dan.
Of course. Yeah, and these questions I think are pretty quick. They're about development of alternatives for resolving identified issues. So alternative mitigations. So are those are, am I right in thinking those are typically developed external to the model? It's kind of a discussion process to identify what are likely opportunities for for addressing an identified overload.
Omir, you can go further into this if you want to, but I'd say it definitely involves discussions. It's an iterative process with transmission operations. The independent system operator, as an example, the one that's been this is all publicly available, the MISO MVP projects, like how do we do these big interconnection lines? involve multiple utilities all talking together in terms of how we're going to wheel power, where a new generation is likely to come in. There is no one individual approach, I would say, to that. It really is a lot comes down to operations, experience, and all that good stuff in terms of where we think the system is going, in terms of where you're going to where you're going to string wires up, where you're going to reconductor and all that good stuff. Omir, did I do that justice, or do you think you want to build anything more on that, sir?
Yeah, I can add some color to this. I think you're 100% correct, Andrew, from kind of like the ISO perspective, but I think maybe Dan was maybe talking more like, you know, utility runs a study, we see all these issues. Well, okay, you run PSSC, PowerGen, Terra, and you see 5 transmission lines are overloaded and you have some voltage issues at like 2 substations because the voltage is too low. Now, you could just say, okay, let's fix these 5 transmission lines. We need a certain MVA rating so that we are back in reliability, and we can add some capacitor to these substations that are showing low voltage now. However, there is always a lot of talk in utilities for alternative mitigations, where is that really the best solution? Because you can fix the system 20 different ways to not only help you for the issue you see now, but also potentially under other outage conditions. So those alternative type of mitigations are talked inside a utility, with the ISO and stuff. It's something you can definitely look inside the system to come up with kind of an optimized alternative solution. Is that kind of more than what a lot of lines you were looking for?
Yeah, I suspect there's no, well, as Andrew said, there's multiple ways of looking at this. Yeah, I'm just curious kind of what typifies best practices in terms of making sure you're not leaving any big stones unturned. That's
a lot of this does roll up into the integrated transmission planning process too, where you're looking at that aggregate picture of, okay, well, I build this transmission line for a certain capital cost, but now what does that do to my dispatch? So that really goes into that combined aggregate economic looks of how do you justify that at the end of the day? And there's multiple ways of doing that, kind of rolling up through that process, Dan. But a lot of where I go into when I go into this is too, what's my change in system NPV in terms of if I build this transmission line, how much can I bring up this generator? What does that reduce the production? What does that reduce the production cost of another unit? And what's the total system savings cost? That's another way of looking at this as well, that combined aggregate transmission generator economics stuff too.
I think I'll stop my questions there. You guys have been really helpful. I really appreciate it, and I hope that others feel the same way. It seems like staff has done a great job in identifying you as the independent transmission analyst, and look forward to how you're going to help out in these upcoming processes. So thanks very much.
Thank you for your questions, sir. We really appreciate it. The interaction was a lot of fun. So again, just personal thanks to you as well. It's not much fun if I just sit here and say stuff all day and nobody interacts with us. So thank you.
Yeah, so thanks to everybody, and also much credit to the folks at Excel Public Service. They were very instrumental in helping us through the vetting process and getting to contract with Altig. But yes, we look forward to continued discussions, and Dan, we can follow up a little on sort of next steps from this workshop. But thank you all very, very much, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of their afternoon.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye.